When an Algerian 17-year-old was shot and killed by French police, it triggered nearly a full week of violent rioting in the streets.
French cities, and especially Paris's suburbs, are again combustible.
Tens of thousands of officers were deployed daily. Cars and public buildings were set on fire. And this past weekend, what one mayor called an assassination attempt, a burning car slamming into his home.
Vincent Jeanbrun wasn't home, but his wife and kids were. She broke her leg escaping. One of the kids was also injured.
It all forced the president, Emmanuel Macron, to cancel an official visit to Germany, holding a special security meeting at home instead. And now we're left with the question, why is Paris always burning? What is it about France in particular that so often leads to this kind of mass mobilization that we saw this past week, that we saw earlier this year, and that we seem to see year after year after year?
And in France, there definitely is more of a culture of going out to demonstrate. For everything, really.
So hang with me for a moment. I promise this history lesson will be really short. All you really need to understand is that France is a country where the idea of revolution is truly baked in. The French Revolution of 1789. It was a massive uprising against royal excess, mandatory tithing and taxes, rising costs, and which eventually led to the king's beheading, the only king of France ever to be executed. 40 years later, the July Revolution saw the overthrow of another king, King Charles X. And less than 20 years after that, King Charles's successor would himself face revolt. Even the French national anthem is a song of revolution. And a really violent one, too. Like, if you've ever read the lyrics, Aux armes citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons. Now that literally says, to arms, citizens, form your battalions, let's march, may impure blood water our furrows. Like, I'm not even exactly sure what furrows are, but that sounds really intense.
It's not just about voting or being a political activist for some people, but having the possibility to demonstrate is really something that's quite fundamental.
The most destructive night of rioting France has seen in years left few cities untouched and hundreds of people under arrest.
So there's this great opening line of an article on Dazed on this very topic of French protest. Stagnant wages, smash up a bank. Elitist education policies, burn some cars. Complacent royal family, revolution. It really sums up well a country that never quite left 1789 behind. A history rich with insurrection and general strikes over a whole range of issues. So racism is a big one, with this long-standing undertone of frustration against police and their use of force. Labor is another. You know, everything to do with wages, the cost of living. You might also remember this long series of pension reform protests from earlier this year.
This is all because France's government, and the president in particular, is trying to make people work 2 more years than they do now to collect their pension.
Le Monde covered those protests extensively and did a really nice job putting this data together from March 7th. So this is just one day where they tallied media estimates of how big that day's protests really were. Thousands of people in each of various cities. But then you add in police estimates. Each of these blue dots, depending on size, is around 10 to 20,000 people. Then you look at the union estimates, and you have some individual protests swelling into the hundreds of thousands. Altogether, well over 1 million people nationwide hitting the streets. I also remember several years ago, there was even a widespread strike, thousands of people strong in several major French cities, of taxi drivers upset about the arrival of Uber.
Now, taxis in Paris are blocking access to the city's airports and train stations today, protesting against Uber.
They blocked roads, burned cars and tires, fights broke out, traffic slowed to an absolute crawl. They called Uber economic terrorism.
Our rules are strict. We buy our licenses and they cost a lot. We can't do what we want.
So in Canada, we tend to see strike action follow a failed negotiation. The recent federal workers' strike makes this point pretty well.
And we will remain on strike until the government addresses our key issues.
At its peak, we saw more than 100,000 people go on strike, but that was only after years of failed talks. In France, you often see strike action come before talks even start. A few years ago, when pension reforms were being proposed, there were large-scale protests before any laws even went into effect. It showed the government workers were angry, and as a way of applying pressure, it did work to an extent. The government made certain concessions, changed the timeline of the law, even inserted some exemptions.
This is the way it usually works when it comes to striking. And kind of strike action needing to be effective and needing to show that strike is actually going to matter.
So there's very much this flexing of union muscle, and the French public is very often largely on side. You know, there's this movement called the Yellow Vests, which was a really broad movement about the high cost of living, social inequality, that sort of thing. You know, somewhat different than the Yellow Vests we see here in Canada. But a poll from a few years ago suggested almost 2/3 of French citizens either identified as a yellow vest, or if not, at least supported their fight.
There are a number of protests that have resulted in governments basically withdrawing the law or the law project that was protested against. And, you know, it's happened in the past. Actually, it's happened to all recent presidents. François Mitterrand, Jacques Chirac, François Hollande, Nicolas Sarkozy, they've all had laws that they've had to withdraw.
You know, people often wonder, the French already seem to have it so good, right? A lower pension age, a lower inflation rate, fewer working hours, you know, than much of Europe. So why do they seem so aggrieved? Well, I suspect the French might think of it the other way around. You know, the only reason they've got it so good is because they fought so hard for it.
Nous, on est retraités et on soutient tous les travailleurs qui vont avoir besoin de la retraite comme nous.
Parce que je veux une société où on soit tous, on vive bien. Et là, on est en train de faire que les gens ils survivent et ils se bouffent les uns les autres pour survivre. Et ça, c'est pas une société que je veux.
There's this idea that if you ask for a lot, maybe you get a little. But if you ask for a little, maybe you get nothing. You know, it's called the radical flank effect, where the extreme wings of any protest movement, even if they don't get exactly what they're asking for, still end up affecting life for everyone downstream. For many in France, there is no badge of honor for suffering. Their social contract is as clear as it is cyclical. We work hard, the state agrees to support our well-being, and that's why we continue to work hard. But this prevailing sentiment de déclassement, this feeling that the current generation is being pushed down the ladder, you know, whether it's to do with wages, race, or anything in between, many believe that will always be worth fighting.